We're going to discuss temperature regulation, otherwise known as thermoregulation. Now, thermoregulation is extremely important in homeotherms, which you see to the left, which would be a wolf. Humans are also homeotherms. We are able to maintain a relatively constant internal body temperature despite changes in our environment. So if I go outside in the middle of summer in Texas, or if I go outside in New York in the middle of winter, my body temperature still remains in a relatively narrow range. This is unlike poikilotherms, like you see here with the amphibian, whose internal environments or internal temperature depends upon their external environment. And an advantage for homeotherms is that despite the changes in ambient temperature, they were able to maintain a relatively constant activity level. So if, for example, the poikilotherms, like the frogs, in the middle of winter, you don't see frogs hanging around in the middle of winter up in New York. They're buried underneath ponds, buried up in mud, because they're not very active. They can't be very active when the temperature's too low. So they kind of just like, not really technically hibernate, but they kind of go in a very dormant state. We, on the other hand, are able to maintain activity levels despite changes in the environment because we can maintain a relatively constant body temperature. Another important reason that we have to maintain that body temperature is that body processes will be severely affected if the temperatures get too high or too low, and I'm talking about your core body temperature. There are variations in your core body temperature, and we're talking about the temperature within the deep tissues. There are variations out there. If you want to use the range for those who use the Celsius system, like the Canadians, the range is anywhere from, what you see over to the right, is from 36 to 37.5 degrees Celsius. For the Americans who still have yet to adapt or adopt the Celsius system, the range is anywhere from about 97 degrees Fahrenheit to about 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit, with the average is considered to be between 98 and 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So although people always say when you check your temperature, if your body temperature is over 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, they say you're running a temperature or running a fever. There are people who are around there who have a higher core body temperature. So we'll talk about later some variations or things that can be attributed to variations in core body temperature. They include things like just the time of day, what part of the menstrual cycle a female's in, whether or not you've acclimatized to a particular environment. So there's some ranges. Now, skin temperature is much more variable. So this is what we're actually measuring at the skin. Now that's going to be important in thermoregulation. So if you are in a hot environment, we want to be able to cool ourselves, and so we're going to bring more of our blood flow to the skin to allow us to release some body heat. If body temperature, or if the environment becomes cold, we kind of restrict blood flow to the skin so we can try to maintain core body temperature, which is much more important to maintain than it is skin temperature. So kind of think about that's why that we tend to start losing noses and ears and toes and stuff when people get out there in the cold. It's more important to maintain core body temperature, and they could care less about what happens to your extremities. Now, the maintenance of body temperature has been extremely important in humans because I had mentioned before is that a lot of body systems, enzymes, things like that will not work properly unless you're in a relatively narrow temperature range. Well, we have evolved a number of mechanisms that allowed us to maintain homeostasis. And in this case, the homeostasis applies to body temperature. Now, we have to try to maintain a balance between heat gain and heat loss. And so if our heat generation is greater than heat loss, your body temperature is going to rise. And if your heat loss is greater than heat generation, your body temperature will drop. We are going to try to maintain the balance between heat gain and heat loss. Now, we always lose heat to our environments, but we want to be able to lose heat at the same rate in which our body is generating heat. So let's just kind of discuss some of the ways in which you normally generate heat. Well, heat is just a normal byproduct of metabolism. When you oxidize, say, carbohydrates or fats, you're trying to get some ATP. Well, the amount of energy in that food to start with and the amount of energy that is produced as ATP is not the same. But the law of thermodynamics says that the amount of energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but it changes forms. And the amount of energy that you start with has to be the amount of energy you end with. So if we're not getting the same amount of energy as ATP, where's some of that energy going? Well, it changed forms, and it changed form as heat. So the same amount of energy results from the oxidation of those fuels, but some of that energy is released as heat. So your basal metabolic rate, just basal metabolism, is going to generate heat. Well, other things can affect heat generation. Your activity level. Are you exercising? Are you sleeping? Hormones. Things like thyroid hormones. Your the results of sympathetic stimulation, the hormones released from that would be epinephrine and norepinephrine. Also, growth hormone and testosterone can increase heat generation just by the processes in which we digest food and oxidize them generates heat. So they refer to it as thermogenic effect of food. All of these are kind of linked to metabolism of cells. So things like thyroid hormones increases metabolism in the cells, which results in more heat generation. Now, heat loss is determined by a couple things. How fast the heat is going to be transmitted from your core up to the skin or conducted to the skin, and then the rate in which the heat is then released to the environment. So things that can influence that rate of heat transfer would be things like insulation. Insulation as a result of adipose tissue. Adipose tissue really slows down heat transfer. So it allows you to, or I should say, heat transfer to the skin into the environment. So people who have a lot of fat can don't lose the heat to their environment as quickly. They're also going to be due by or influenced by blood flow to the skin, because a very important way in which we can increase heat loss would be to increase blood flow to the skin. And your environment also plays a role. Is it cool outside? Is it hot outside? So, for example, when we release heat to the environment, if the temperature of the air that's over your skin is the same as the temperature of your skin, you will not lose the heat anymore. So that will also play a role. Now here, this picture is example of what you would see in Guyton, your textbook, which demonstrates the vascular supply to your skin, and this is an important means for heat transfer, heat loss. So we have we have the skin capillaries, which is supplies the venous plexuses of the skin. The small arteries also supply blood to the venous plexuses of the skin. And what you'll notice is, for example, look at this artery and the venous plexus. You have a lot of these shunts, or AV shunts, arteriovenous anastomosis, or shunts. These will be very important to whether or not I want to increase blood flow to the skin or restrict blood flow to the skin. So the sympathetic nervous system can control the vessel diameter. It can constrict the arterioles and these AV anastomoses, and that supply the venous plexus of the skin. If it constricts, you will not have as much blood flow to the skin, and you will not lose heat if you increase the diameter, you're going to have a lot more blood flow to the skin, and it'll increase heat loss. So let's look at the mechanisms by which we can transfer heat. And this is my picture of, I say it's a huge naked giant going on a hike up in the mountains, because look at the size of these trees. This guy has to be a giant. And the picture is trying to demonstrate different mechanisms of heat transfer. So one of the things that you see is some radiation of heat outside to his environment, and radiation is where warm objects lose energy, and they lose energy as infrared heat rays. Most of our energy lost is from radiation. About 60% is lost as radiation. You'll notice here's a warm object. There's the sun. Solar radiation releases heat, but obviously this can influence my skin temperature. I can get warm by the radiation of heat from the sun, and it can affect my skin temperature. Now we are going to lose heat from radiation. You can also transfer heat by conduction. Conduction means to carry. Well, here this person is conducting some, or transferring some heat through conduction to the ground. You could probably use the analogy of when you sit in a chair for a while, you get up and you feel the chair is warm. So you've physically or directly transferred energy through physical contact. This is not a very effective mechanism for either gaining or losing heat. There's some things that will determine by the temperature of the object, the amount of surface area that's involved. But like if you use like a thermal blanket, or one of the blankets that you can plug in, and I can't remember what it's called, but those blankets that you can plug in the wall and it keeps you warm. Yeah, you can transfer some heat from the blanket directly to you. Now we don't lose a lot of heat by conduction, but you still have to understand what conduction is. Well, the conduction, physical conduction of the heat to the air is very significant, but it's limited in that you must have proper amount of air circulation over the skin to take that heat away. And that removal of heat away from the skin is called convection. So this allows us to kind of carry the heat away from the skin. So the conduction of heat is going to be limited by whether or not you have circulating air around that body. So you think about why you would like to have a little bit of wind when you go outside and make it feel a little bit cooler, or you sit behind a fan. That allows you to cool a little bit better. The other one that we're going to look at is evaporation. So if you're sweating, and when the sweat evaporates off of your skin, it carries a lot of heat with it. A significant amount of heat is removed from your skin as water evaporates. We also have some evaporation just from breathing, and you also have some evaporation or some loss of water through your skin that is not from sweating. So remember, in earlier lectures we talked about insensible water loss. That's water loss that we are unaware of. And when we talk about the insensible water loss through the skin, that is not sweating. Sweating is different. But sweating we can control. We cannot control the evaporation of water from your airways. We cannot control that insensible water loss from the skin, but we can control sweating. So that'll be an important means by which we can lose heat to our surroundings. Now clothing does affect heat loss. So if you have clothing on you, that will limit your ability to lose the heat. So obviously if you're in a cold environment, you want to wear some clothes. If you're in a hot environment, the less the clothes, the better. And I guess this guy is walking up the mountain pretty much naked because it's hot. But obviously I don't recommend you guys doing that. So the heat loss will be diminished by clothing. That's important in cold environments. But If the clothing gets wet, you will lose the effectiveness of that protection because the water will carry and conduct the heat from your skin out to the environment very quickly. So you need to make sure that if you're in a cold environment that clothing does not become wet. If you think about in the movies where people fall into the lake in the middle of winter, and the first thing to get them out of the lake is they start taking all their clothes off because that's going to make them get colder quicker by having the wet clothing on them. So we need to get them out of the wet clothes. The sweating, since we're talking about this evaporation through skin, the sweating is real important in thermal regulation, and there are actually people who are born without sweat glands. So they are not able to temperature regulate very well, so they have to be very careful in what they do and where they go. So let's just discuss sweating. Now, sweating is regulated by your autonomic nervous system. What is interesting is the sweat glands are innervated by sympathetic nerves, but these particular sympathetic nerves have cholinergic nerve endings. So remember what cholinergic nerve endings, they release acetylcholine. Well, although this is a sympathetic nerve, has cholinergic nerve fibers, these will affect the production of sweat. Now, the primary secretion from these sweat glands is very similar to plasma minus your proteins. So it's similar in electrolyte concentration, things like that. Well, it's primarily secreted here by the gland, and then as it moves through the duct up to the surface of the skin, they'll have some absorption of some of your electrolytes, primarily sodium and chloride. Now, what eventually you get up here will be your sweat. How the rate, or I should say the stimulation of these glands, will determine exactly kind of the composition of the sweat. So if you kind of have slight stimulation or activation by these sympathetic nerves, you'll this will be secreted and you'll have plenty of time to absorb the sodium and the chloride. So mostly what you're going to be losing is water and not sodium and chloride. If you have really strong stimulation of the gland, you're going to have a large amount of this secretion produced, but you're not going to be able to absorb quite as much sodium and chloride. And also, what also does occur on here is you do reabsorb some water. So, but you're going to could have a significant amount of electrolyte loss if you have very strong stimulation of the gland. Well, then you have to ask yourself, well, could I have an issue in losing significant amount of electrolytes when I sweat? Yes, that can happen, but we do have ability to acclimatize to heat in which we will not lose as much of sodium and chloride. And aldosterone plays a very important role. So you see how many times we've talked about aldosterone throughout the trimester? So this is a relatively important hormone. So besides affecting the kidney tubules, the late distal tubule, the cortical collecting duct, it also affects your sweat glands. And what happens is, if people are living in a hot environment over a period of a number of weeks, they are going to start to be able to produce a lot of sweat, which will allow them to lose heat at a greater extent than prior, but they will conserve more sodium and chloride. So the aldosterone will affect the ducts and allow them to conserve a lot more sodium. So they will have less electrolyte loss after they've acclimatized to that environment. So if you're going to move to a hot environment, if you want to be more efficient, you need allow yourself some time to acclimate or acclimatize to that environment. Now, we're going to talk about how we regulate the body temperature. We will again talk about sweating again. We're going to talk about some other things, some skin flow or blood flow to the skin, like I mentioned earlier. So that stuff is going to come back. But we're going to see how other things that help control body temperature, and now specifically discuss the role of your hypothalamus. We have a thermoregulatory center in the hypothalamus, and we have what we call a thermostat. It's in the preoptic area of the anterior hypothalamus, which contains a large number of neurons that are either sensitive to heat or cold. So if body temperature goes up, these heat-sensitive neurons increase their firing rate, which will elicit certain responses or influence effectors. If the body temperature drops, these cold neurons will increase their firing rate, which then influences certain effectors and allows us to maintain a relatively normal body temperature. So it's kind of a classic negative feedback. If, example here, they say if body temperature rises, then we have receptors that are in the skin that we have like this, the receptors in the skin. We do have warm and cold receptors. Apparently, though, we have about 10 times more cold receptors than warm. But these receptors detect that the body temperature is starting to change. We also have temperature receptors in the deep tissues. They're going to send information, afferent, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, afferent information to the hypothalamus, to this preoptic area of the anterior hypothalamus. We have an integration center, which is in the posterior hypothalamus, which is integrating information from a number of different signals and says, okay, I need to do something. I need to get the body temperature back to normal. In this scenario, we say body temperature went up. It will influence a number of effectors to get body temperature, to allow us to cool, to get body temperature back down. So various effectors include sweat glands, blood vessels, arterioles, veins, and skeletal muscle can be influenced by whether body temperature goes up or go down. So if you kind of look at this scenario, we have kind of a set point in body temperature, but these can be influenced by a number of different things that we'll kind of mention later. If the core temperature changes, it sends out a signal like, oh, temperature's changed, we need to get it back to the preset point. So this will send information, the temperature sensors in the skin, get the integration of thermal signals by the posterior hypothalamus. That will send out efferent information to a number of different things. And I also have to include the cerebral cortex. One of the things that you do if your body temperature starts to increase or decrease is you change your behavior. We also have, some of us can tolerate higher temperatures than others, but the cerebral cortex will say, hey, a little too warm for me or a little too cold. You will change your behavior, and we'll give you some examples. You also will affect whether or not you sweat, whether or not you dilate or constrict the blood vessels to the skin, whether or not you're going to shiver or not. So if I shiver, I can increase heat production. If you want to cool, you definitely want to make sure you're not shivering. So we have a lot of different effectors that are involved in maintaining that body temperature. So let's go through two scenarios. Obviously, there's only two scenarios. If my body temperature increases, I want to elicit effects that will promote heat loss. I want to do certain things to allow me to lose more heat. You want to increase blood flow to the skin. If you increase blood flow to the skin, you'll be able to lose heat by radiation. As long as you have good circulation of air across the skin, you're going to lose heat by convection. And just think about when you get a little bit warm, your skin starts to look red because all that increased blood flow to the skin. You're going to stimulate these sweat glands. So sympathetic stimulation to the sweat glands is going to allow you to produce sweat. And you're going to lose heat to promote heat loss by evaporation. So you see how those mechanisms of heat loss, I'm applying it now. So you can lose heat by evaporation. You can lose heat by convection. in radiation. Technically, I could put this, and this is going to be kind of linked to behavioral, is you ever see if any of you have animals and you took them out for a walk and it was warm, they got home, they sprawl themselves out on the cold tile because they can increase the heat loss from their skin to the tile, and that would be more like conduction. So we could do the same thing too. So that could also allow you for heat loss. You're not going to produce as much heat, so you're not going to be stimulating shivering. Your respiration also increases. The respiratory centers are stimulated, and your depth of respiration and the rate increases. And the idea is, like this guy here, is open mouth breathing increases your loss of heat from evaporation. That's why dogs pant, is it allows them to. Dogs are covered with hair. Unfortunately, they're limited by some of the ways they can lose heat, so they're going to pant. So we can pant too. Well, I wouldn't. Well, I've actually, never mind. If I'm dying, I'm usually not panting. I'm more like sound like I have asthma if I'm dying. Now, behavioral control. So if it's really hot out, think about what things that people do when it's too hot out to promote heat loss. You're going to remove some clothing. You're going to increase your surface area. So you're going to lay down, sprawl your arms and legs out. That will allow you to lose more heat to the environment. So increase your surface area so you can promote more heat loss. So there's a lot of different things behavior-wise, which are going to be controlled by that cerebral cortex. If I can get to a fan, I'm going to get to a fan. If I can go jump in some cold water, I'll do that. So that would also be a mechanism to promote heat loss. Now, if I'm in a cold environment, I don't want to lose heat. I want to prevent heat loss, and I also want to be able to generate heat. So the first thing we look at is to prevent heat loss. So you want to conserve heat. So one of the things you'll do is you're going to constrict blood going to those venous plexuses of the skin. So that's why your skin starts to look kind of pale, maybe bluish if it's restricted enough. So you're going to reduce your heat loss from radiation, conduction, and convection. And believe it or not, your epithelial cells can tolerate temperatures pretty low without them being damaged. But even though the epithelial cells can tolerate temperatures without being damaged, body functions will not work well if body temperature gets too low. We also have a mechanism to allow us to conserve body heat because we have countercurrent exchange in the blood vessels in the skin. Now, you've heard about countercurrent mechanism, or the countercurrent multiplier when we talk about the renal system. Whole idea of countercurrent is you got one, in this case, one vessel going one direction, blood flow in the other vessels is going the opposite, and they're right next to each other. They're going countercurrent. What happens because of the arrangement in the skin, or in your limbs, I should say, the warm blood from your trunk is coming out to your periphery. Well, because of this cool blood coming back from the trunk, a lot of this heat is going to be transferred right to the venous blood. And so by the time the warm blood, or this blood, goes out to the distal capillaries, a lot of heat has already been lost, or not lost, has been conserved in this case. So the blood out here is about like 13 degrees cooler than when we started with. So we're not going to lose as much heat out here because we've already kind of kept some of it in the interior. It's been trapped to your core. So these are mechanisms to help prevent heat loss. We can also try to generate more heat if trying to maintain our warmth. So you can shiver. So again, the hypothalamus is going to be sending out efferent information to the muscles, and what it does is it innervates the agonist and antagonist muscles, and what happens is you start to shiver. You have really no net movement. It just kind of goes back and forth, but when you allow muscles to contract, you generate heat. That's just a normal byproduct of muscle contraction, is to lose heat. So by shivering, you can generate heat. We also have non-shivering thermogenesis, which is really going to be only in humans, only important in the infants because of brown fat. That's something you would have talked about in Biochemistry 1. So the brown fat has thermogenin, which is an uncoupling protein. So when brown fat is oxidized, a lot of the energy is released as heat rather than making ATP. There's also hormones, and these should have been moved over to the left because not really part of non-shivering thermogenesis per se, is your release of the sympathetic hormones. When I say epinephrine being a sympathetic hormone, in response to sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal medulla, epinephrine is released. Norepinephrine is released by the medulla, but also your sympathetic nerves. These hormones increase activity in which you generate more heat. Thyroid hormones also act as increasing metabolism, but they also can act as uncouplers, so you can generate more heat. You also will have behavioral responses to prevent heat loss. So you see this cute little puppy dog over here. This dog is curling up in a tight ball. He's trying to reduce his surface area so he doesn't promote heat loss. He's trying to keep his body as close as possible together to prevent heat loss. And a lot of you have probably done this when you've gotten cold. You kind of curl yourself up in a little ball. The dog has an advantage, though. It has its own fur coat, but you can go and cover yourself up, behaviorally, go cover yourself up with some more blankets, or go get yourself next to a oh God, am I blanking? Those things you buy and you plug in the wall and they generate heat. I mean, that's stupid that I can't remember what that is. Or go to next to a furnace or something like that so you can gain more heat. You can, or people can, acclimatize to the cold, and it's very significant in animals. Animals that are prolonged or exposed to prolonged cold temperatures increase heat generation quite a lot when exposed to the cold. The acclimatization to cold in humans can't be measured as well or studied as well because humans are unwilling to expose themselves to the temperatures that some animals are subjected to. But by just observational studies and some other studies that's been done on people like the military that have been in the Arctic, they have been found to have increased metabolic rates, greater metabolic rates than people that are military that are in warmer environments. The Inuits, they have abnormally high metabolic rates, so they can generate more heat to try to prevent or maintain core body temperatures. What's interesting is the incidence of goiters is greater in cold environments than warm. So then you have to ask yourself, why would that happen? Well, if you remember from endocrine physiology, when we talked about a goiter, you could probably figure out why. So goiters, where you have increased growth of the thyroid gland. And what stimulates growth of the thyroid gland? Thyroid stimulating hormone. That hormone stimulates growth of the thyroid gland, but what else does it do? It increases the production of thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. So why would you be producing more TSH? Well, the thyroid gland, in response to cold, your hypothalamus, in response to cold, will secrete more TRH. Now, TRH causes an increase in TSH by the anterior pituitary. The TSH then affects the production of T3 and T4 by the thyroid gland. Well, those hormones increase metabolism. They increase heat generation. So you're going to have higher thyroid hormone levels in people that are acclimatized to the cold and trying to increase their metabolic rates and maintain core body temperature. So in response, as a side effect though, their thyroid glands become enlarged. Well, some examples of individual variations in body temperature or set point to maintenance of body temperature include things like acclimatization, whether or not you're acclimatized, circadian rhythms, phases of the menstrual cycle, and things like fever. So if you do a Google search, it's kind of interesting if you go on and type in Tierra del Fuego. I don't even know if there's very few people that are considered to be pure descendants of people from Tierra del Fuego. But years and years and years ago, when the explorers went to Tierra del Fuego, they found that these people lived in this very, very cold environment, naked. They once lived naked in the snow. So, I wonder what it is about them that they were able to tolerate such cold temperatures not wearing any clothes. So somehow they acclimatized to that cold environment. Hawaiians, native Hawaiians, they say generally if it starts to get below 72 degrees Fahrenheit, they start unpacking their sweaters. I could probably say that about a lot of Texans too. You start, like, if it gets below a certain temperature, like, oh my gosh, that's too cold, I got to get out my sweater, I need to turn on the furnace. And I actually do believe in acclimatization because I'm originally from New York. When I came down to Texas, I'm like, oh my gosh, it is too hot, I can't stand it. When it got cold here, I was like, I love it. And what Texans say is cold, I as a New Yorker say, what, you nuts? We'd be wearing shorts now. Well, as I've lived here for a number of years, I have now become acclimatized somewhat to Texas in the fact that I can't stand the cold as much. I go back home and I almost die from how cold it is, and I'm ashamed to say that I can't stand the cold as much. But I'm still not quite used to the heat, though. Unfortunately, I will not allow myself to go outside to acclimatize to the heat. Other things that will determine some variations in body temperature are circadian rhythms. A circadian rhythm is something to do with like it's a rhythmic pattern in a physiologic function. Where, like, example for circadian rhythms would be like some hormones, that they're higher in the morning and lower in the evening. Those are things referred to as circadian rhythms. Apparently, our temperatures are the lowest several hours before we wake up, and they tend to be higher in late afternoon or evening. So kind of corresponds to, I think, activity level though. But they said there's normal variations during the day in your body temperature. For females, we do have variations in temperature with the menstrual cycle. And people utilize that to advantage a lot of times if they're trying to become pregnant, because I know that temperature will change like right before they ovulate, so they kind of track it. They say temperature is the lowest just before you ovulate. So that's why a lot of women track their body temperature if they're trying to become pregnant. Fever also will affect that body temperature. Pyrogens are released from bacteria or even your body tissues, and a pyrogen is something that it literally means generation of fire or heat. Pyrogens will reset the thermostat at a higher value. I mean, it will physically reset it. So you start doing these things which you're going to conserve body heat, you're going to generate more heat. The purpose of it is to kill off the bugs. That's what it's trying to do. The interleukin-1, that is a cytokine, that if it's released into body fluids by immune cells, can increase your body temperature within just a few minutes. And what it does, it's mediated through PGE2. one of your prostaglandins. If I asked you, what is the effect of aspirin? 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 What is